We're getting ready to stitch area 6, and area 6 is a scallop design. You have scallops both on the bottom and the top of the area, and that gives you this cool little intersection of petals and diamonds. So it's a really great motif for a border. You have to make sure when you choose the semicircle to choose one that's actually going to cover more than half the border if you want that intersection. So I've gone ahead and figured it out for you in this case, and I already have my circle ready to go here. So the semicircles in this row are 4 inches. If I quilted a full circle around, it would be a 4-inch circle. That means I need a ruler that measures 3.5 inches if I'm stitching around the outside of the ruler. So you'll notice I have 2 rulers nested together. BERNINA ruler sets are nested, which means you have a lot of options in terms of the size of the circles, but it also means you have less surface area if you're just using one of the circles. So typically I'll get around that by taping some together, and I've done that here. I've also done a little bit extra tape on the back just to give us some more stability when we're stitching. I usually do use staple tape or a similar product, but I wanted to show you how you could do it with painter's tape in a pinch, so that's what we're using here. If I was stitching the inside of the circle and I wanted to stitch a 4-inch circle, that would be a pretty big circle I'd need, but I would need a ruler that measures 4.5 from this side to this side, because I'd be stitching internally instead of externally. In this case, you can see externally this measures 3.5, so that's going to stitch a 4-inch circle, and internally it measures 1.5, so that's going to stitch a 1-inch circle on the inside. So I'm going to go ahead and use this ruler, and it has quadrant lines on it. If I make sure that the quadrant lines are lined exactly with the edge of the area, I will be stitching a full semicircle. If I don't pay attention to my quadrant lines, I could be a little off, and that will result in a semicircle that doesn't come quite as far down into the block as I'd like. So I got to watch my alignment. Now, in the directions, I tell you where to start, and that's this first mark at the top. And so you're going to start right here, and I'm going to bring up my needle. Excuse me, my bobbin thread. You always want to bring up your bobbin thread, because if you don't, it will look fine from the front and not so great when you turn around the quilt. So notice I didn't bring up my ruler until I made a few stitches. I'm now going to bring up my ruler because I don't want to crash down on my ruler. If I position my ruler right as we talked about, with those quadrant lines sitting right there on the edge of my block, I should be able to stitch from this mark to this mark with no problem. Now, typically, especially in a domestic, the rulers can shift. So what I recommend is stitching halfway around and stopping. And then if you have any, like say your ruler has slipped a little this way, line it up again. So basically I stitch a quadrant and then another quadrant. I find that is easier, especially on a domestic machine where there's more slippage. So I'm going to line this up and stitch all the way down. Now, my next arc is going to be a partial semicircle because there's not 4 inches of space on this block, on the edge of the block. So I'm still going to line up my quadrant lines just like they would normally be lined up, and I'm going to stitch all the way over till I get to the edge of the area. I have to create a mirror image of this design now. So what I can do is take my straight line ruler and stitch up the top a little bit, because I have to create a mirror image of that. So now I'm going to put the ruler down like this, make sure it's lined up with this mark, and it's actually a 1/4 inch away from this mark, right? And make sure that's lined up. And in this case, I'm actually, let me move the ruler so you can see this for a minute. There's a faint blue line here. I'm actually using that as the base of my semicircle in this case, because this is just a basing line that will be lined up, that will be covered up by binding. So I'm actually going to use that mark as the stitching mark, and I'm going to go up and over. Now, I happen to be at the right point for that. That doesn't always happen for me. If I'm not at the right point, I might have to stitch up or down the border a little bit just to get to the right point. Okay, so now I'm going to line this up, and you'll notice my quadrant marks, they're not on the red line, they're a little above. Let me see if I can zoom in a little bit for you. You can see my unmanicured hands. But you know, I would have to take time out from quilting for that, and I just won't do that unless it's a very special occasion. Okay, so now I'm going to move this over and do one more arc, and you know I'm going to stop when I get to the edge of the block. Okay, I need to create the mirror image of this arc, so actually I'm going to use my ruler and quilt a little down the block to get to my next starting point. I'm just guessing here. You get better at the guessing with practice. But if I'm a little off, if I get over here and I find I've gone a little bit too far, I'll just stitch a few stitches down to get where I need to be. And then stitch over. Now, I need to do a few stitches close together before I end the threads, so kind of lock them in place. And to end my threads, I bring my needle up and my presser foot up. I grab onto the top thread and I do one more stitch. Now, if you're on a domestic, this is important. I would use the buttons rather than the foot pedal for this, because sometimes it's easy to get 2 or 3 stitches and then they lock up if you use the foot pedal. Oops, it didn't grab it that time. I think it actually broke the thread. Oh no, here it is. Okay, and I'm going to clip the threads. And there you have it. That's how you do a scalloped border.